So thank you very much for making time to find out more about what's going on with OSTA and with the driver shortage and how we're going to be delivering service. So I just get you to switch the slide, please. So it always starts off with where the money comes from. And so this is a very simple graph that shows that the base GSN, which is the grant for student needs, is the money that typically would come directly from the ministry to the school boards. Now, this year, the ministry has stated that they have increased the GSN. However, the GSN is not the sole source of funding that we would have, or operators would have normally received through the ministry. There was also fuel escalation at a peg price of of 96 cents. There's also the driver retention program, which was offered directly to drivers through a third party. And those two funds were eliminated. Some of them have been integrated into the base GSN or as part of the GSN, and the rest of the funds were eliminated. So when we start looking at how much money did OSTA used to get or did receive last year for all of the operations, it was about $81.5 million. And with this new funding formula, the school boards would be receiving about 75 million. So there's definitely a funding gap between what we used to receive, which is still with a deficit, and what we are receiving now, which just has increased that funding gap. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sample of how the funding formula is applied in real life in our contracts. We have two samples, operator A, operator B. These are actual contracts that we had last year, and it demonstrates what the contracted compensation was for OSTA versus what the Ministry of Education is identifying as appropriate funding for that transportation. So you can see that there's a very big difference. Operator A has almost an 18% cut expected, whereas operator B has a 15% cut. The boards in OSTA cannot simply say, well, we're going to cut your compensation because the ministry is not funding us. We have contracts in place. We are required to provide fuel adjustments based on the original peg price and not on a peg price of $1.50. So this is a big difference between what we are required to pay through contracts and what the ministry is funding. Now, the vans were not funded at all. So the needs-based formula is about vehicles. They are paying a certain amount per yellow bus and a certain amount per minibus. They did not fund any of the vans. We were expected to go through the local priorities fund, which is a different bucket that's included in the formula, and we had to finance the vans through that. Next slide, please. So some of the pressures that we have, first of all, we have contractual obligations. So we have to pay the current fuel escalation, and that has to come out of the local and transition funds. There are no alternatives to vans in our market. So even if we wanted to go to minibuses so that we can get the funding, we don't have any operators right now that have minibuses. So that transition cannot simply be made because funding formula has changed. We need time to review the service delivery model for students with special needs so that we can see what are the most efficient options, as well as taking into account what their needs are, what our geography looks like, and if it's even efficient. So we are going to be looking at this year. Now, this is an old point. We had ongoing negotiations with two mid-sized yellow bus operators. One did settle with us, and the other one did not. And the one that did not, after various conversations throughout the summer, and we were hoping to be able to close that contract after they settled with our coterminous consortia. We just weren't able to meet their request. We don't have the funding available for that. The tricky part is that they are really the only operator out in the area that we need coverage. The other issue that we have is there's really not a lot of capacity left on public transit to create more student routes this year. So last year we transitioned 2,000 more students. I think we're almost at 18 to 19,000 students on OC Transpo. And as you know, they have some pressures of their own. They have driver shortages and they've got issues with LRT. So we are still working with them. Next slide, please. Now, why is there a driver shortage? There are a couple of things that we can identify. First of all, there's a driver shortage across Canada and North America, and it has been going on for many years. Ottawa has been experiencing a driver shortage for at least 5 years, and it's just finally coming to a head where it's more of a crisis as opposed to just trying to deal with um, how that is affecting our service. So Ottawa's labor market is very different than in other jurisdictions. We have a changing demographic, particularly in the West End and in Barrhaven. Those are areas that have lots of new families, families that need to have full-time jobs and not a lot of retirees. And it's the retirees that we're counting on to provide driver services. We also have low immigration since COVID. They are starting to pick up the immigration now. However, because we were behind for approximately 2 years, those are some of the people that would have been in our driver pool. So again, that driver pool has gotten smaller and smaller. There is a tremendous amount of competition with other job options in our market. You can see the signs everywhere. Everyone is hiring, and it's not just part-time or retail jobs. It's all the way up the chain. It seems no matter where you call, they're having a labor shortage. Finally, rural family farms are disappearing. We once upon a time could count on a farmer and farmer wife each having a bus and transporting students in their community to the community school. But as family farms are disappearing and conglomerates are joining them together, we are finding that there's a great reduction of available drivers and parking spots for students out in the rural areas. When we start looking at the pay rates for drivers, so when we first started down this path a few years ago, the average rate of pay was $15 an hour. As the minimum wage rates started to climb, there had to be that differential for the drivers as well. Now, today, the pay rates that are being advertised are between $20 and $21 an hour. We did investigate a couple of years ago to see what it would cost if we wanted to transition the drivers that we already had in place from $18 to $22 an hour, and it would have cost $7 million. So it's not just about raising or increasing pay rates for new drivers. You have to pay all the drivers that you already have in place the same rate. So that's really where that funding gap just becomes even greater. Now, OC Transpo pays $29 an hour. They still have a driver shortage. And that's where some of our bus drivers are going. Now, the Ministry of Education formula states that drivers are to be paid $23 per hour, but it's only on live route miles. So they're not actually including compensation for all the other driving that drivers do, whether they're driving to and from bus yards, which is 4 times a day, they're parking, any of the other drive time that they have is somehow not included in the funding formula. So operators are kind of in a bind in terms of how do you meet the ministry's requirement and still make a business case. And I think this is really what ended up happening with the operator that was out in the rural area. They just didn't have that business case to stay with our contract. Next slide. So what has OSTA done? Last year, we really started to move into some market research. We hired Nanos Research so that we could have them run some focus groups, do some electronic surveys about who would be interested in becoming a driver. What were the job qualifications they thought were important? What did they think was important in terms of messaging? And it confirmed some of the anecdotal information and assumptions that we already knew. about rural areas, about the older generations in various areas of the city. But it also identified some connected parameters that we could share with our marketing firm. And that helped the marketing firm create some new messaging for us. The next step was to establish a task force with our operators. So we actually were able to get the recruiting and the owners together, and they were able to share recruitment strategies, which had never been done in this market before. The recruiting staff were able to share different strategies, but also make sure that if they had some interested candidates that perhaps couldn't be included into their own driver pool simply because maybe they didn't have the type of route that that person was interested in, they would recommend them to another operator. So that person would not really leave the industry. They would still be within the industry. They also coordinated some messaging and resources. So as you'll see later, we created or had the marketing company create some free resources. And we understood that having all that messaging out at the same time created a bigger impression on the public than individual operators trying to advertise at different times. They also were able to provide feedback on our marketing and PR materials. So they were able to distribute surveys to their bus drivers based on some of the images that the marketing firm had created, the messaging. Did they think it was going to work? What were their opinions about it? And so that was another way to get some feedback. So we then hired that marketing firm and they developed the driveyellow.ca website. So this is a central area, a central website that all the operators participate in. And interested candidates can go and look at what the qualifications are. They can find or look at some videos of drivers that talk that speak to about what they like about the job, what their experiences are. Um, and you can candidates can apply directly on this particular website. It connects them with operators within their area that they may be interested in. So we have been then able to keep track of how much interest there has been and connect it to our ad campaigns. Now, this marketing firm also created all the resources that we have that we shared for free on our Drive Yellow with operators and with schools. So you'll see in a little bit how we're partnering with schools as well. So they created and deployed our marketing program, which included curb signs, digital ads, radio, TV ads, and so on. Next slide, please. Now, as the year progressed, I also got in touch with a number of elected officials to talk to them about the Ontario Immigration Nominee Program. So this is a list of trades that are considered uh, sort of low, they have a low labor pool. And this is to allow immigrants that are qualified to provide service in those trades to enter into Canada and begin working much more quickly. So my idea was if we could put bus drivers on that list, that would definitely smooth the way for some of our operators. So I did meet with the MP Yasser Naqvi to talk about Ottawa's labor market and how we could go about adding the bus driver job. And Mr. Naqvi said it's a provincial issue, but he's willing to help. Then I met with MPP Goldie Gamari to discuss adding the bus driver job to the OINP list. And the response was it's a federal issue, but we'll discuss with the Ministry of Labour of Ontario. So I'm still trying to follow up with that. We also worked with the Ministry of Transportation to deal with the high failure rates at drive test centers. So we were seeing a trend that new candidate drivers were being failed at inordinate rates. And after our meeting with the MTO and they started looking at the drive test centers and what was being used for testing, that has smoothed out. So that's very good for us. More drivers are then getting through the process. We also sent messaging and flyers to trustees and city councillors to add to their newsletters or to distribute through their channels. So, they have different sources of information and they're always looking for some material. So we did that. And then we created a recruitment bonus program for schools So using some of OSTA's marketing resources, we created a program that if they attracted a candidate and the candidate was hired by one of our operators, the school would receive $250. So we've actually had good participation, and we're able now to pay two schools already who have brought in two candidates. So that was a really good partnership. We also reviewed all of the recruitment and retention programs for our large vehicle operators. So we've received what their marketing plans are. We've been able to provide some feedback. Voyago, which is the operator that has the largest driver shortage out in the West End, invited us to sit with their recruitment team. And there were 15 people, including the CEO of Transdev that owns Voyago, as well as the vice president of human resources. So they were serious about communicating with us and showing us a presentation of all of the work they're doing to recruit in our market. And they had wonderful graphs that sort of show when the drivers stay, when they leave, why are they leaving, the results of exit interviews. And we were able to give them some advice about tweaking some changes, if you will, that reflect the local market conditions. Now, continuing these strategies this year, these are ongoing. We continued on with our ad campaign throughout the summer, and it's still continuing this fall. Now, OC Transpo. What else have we done? We have coordinated new routes for additional students to be reassigned to public transit. So that's something that we do in March and April. We're almost up to 20,000 eligible students, plus students that are ineligible who buy their own passes. So we coordinate all of that with them. Now, OC Transpo has committed to prioritizing school runs to avoid service cancellations. So they're more likely to cancel runs in other areas of the city so that they can provide service on school runs, which is great. We have a driver shortage for our wheelchair buses. So we've reached out to Paratranspo to see if they can help us in that area. Next slide, please. So really what happened this year? Because it has been a little bit different than other years. We have had driver shortages through COVID and in recovery from COVID. And this year, one van operator declined a contract and another van operator picked up the work. So we were lucky there that there was some capacity. One yellow bus operator declined a contract despite several attempts to re-engage. And they are the only operator in that area. We're not able to replace 36 drivers all in one shot. That's going to take some time. Now, the process in terms of when drivers come in, they come into work in early to mid-August to collect their routes. This is when operators become aware of which drivers are returning and which drivers are deciding not to return. So it is kind of late in the game. They get the routes on the 1st of August, and then they start organizing to have drivers come in for their safety. They also pick up their route and can do their trial runs. This is when the operators really begin to understand the extent of the shortage, and then they try to determine what can be covered with the drivers that they have. Then they let OSTA know. So because we understood that we were going to be short 130 drivers, we delayed the opening of the parent portal so that we could coordinate with the operators on which routes needed to go on the long-term cancellation list, which ones could be covered with regular drivers, and which ones would have spare drivers, so that we could have accurate communication with parents. The last thing we need is to make a bunch of changes immediately after we've opened the parent portal and parents have a certain idea of what to expect. And then after that, change it. So it was a better idea for us, in our opinion, and for parents to delay the opening, make sure we have accurate communication. Next slide, please. So what is going to happen from now on? It takes 2 to 3 weeks, oh, not years, 2 to 3 weeks to stabilize the system after we bring it up. So we still have 65,000 students that are taking transportation. And that's a lot. That's the most in the province, just 65,000, never mind 72,000, which are actually eligible. So Our priority right now is dealing with immediate safety issues. We have the day-to-day daily operations, students getting on wrong buses, getting off at the wrong stop, organizing the timings of things. We've got new drivers that are learning new routes and are trying to learn new students. We have new enrollments coming through daily from the boards, and we have to keep on top of making sure that they get through the whole process. We are prioritizing phone calls first, simply because they're coming through in droves. And then it's transportation issues form, which is an online form that parents can fill. We are sifting through those to identify where we have safety issues that we need to prioritize, and then looking for some of that low-hanging fruit of changes that we can make very quickly. Finally, emails are the last priority, and I can tell you there are thousands sitting in email boxes all over the place. All of our automatic messaging, whenever somebody sends us an email, is we prioritize transportation issues form. Go and send an issues form, please. Now, we are in the process of evaluating potential short-term solutions. These will take several weeks or months to implement. So we have been in touch with coach lines to provide shuttle service for secondary students. That may mean taking students off of yellow bus in established areas so that we can release yellow bus and putting them on shuttles so that we can send those yellow buses out to rural areas. This will be unpopular, I can warn you now, but is the only way that we can provide shuttles in a safe way. We are getting a list of priority schools from the two boards, and that's where we are going to be emphasizing or sending or keeping all of our attention to find solutions first. We are going to be redesigning routes and combining routes together. That will lengthen the routes. It will lengthen the ride times. It will create earlier drops, earlier pickups, and that will also be unpopular, and it may affect routes that are already doing well. We will reassign students that don't have transportation to another route at a farther stop. So perhaps the stop isn't at 400 meters, it could be at 1 kilometer, and parents have to get them to that stop. We are looking at paratransport to give us a hand with the wheelchair service. We may reassign students to OC Transpo where there's capacity, and we may reassign students to vans where they can be integrated with students with special needs. Now, we are going to be creating communication about next steps, exactly as I'm explaining now, and that will be posted on the OSTA website by the end of this week. Next. So in the long term, the ministry is paying for an operational review. They're hoping that they can help us improve efficiency and adapt to the new financial reality. Our goals is to demonstrate the unique parameters of Ottawa and to prove that vans are more efficient than minibus. We're also going to put out an RFI in the next 30 days to see if there are other operators interested in taking over the contract. Will they do it for the ministry's rates? And if not, what would be the potential cost? We are going to be doing a bell time review. We are going to be looking at extending some of the days, perhaps having new start times as late as 10 a.m. and potentially dismissal rate times as late as 4:30 p.m. And of course, the process is we have to get buy-in for those extended times. The bell time review needs to be created. We need to do some consultation, and trustees approve all of those bell time changes. And that has to all be done before February 2024 if we want to implement it for next school year. Then there's a potential new policy, use it or lose it. We know that buses are half empty in some cases. We have called parents over and over to find out if they're willing to let those go, that let their seat go, and they aren't. They're hedging their bets and maintaining their seat just in case. And then finally, can we move all of secondary within the urban transit area to OC Transpo? We have to have discussions with them.